Listen, children, to a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight, for I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. And so we read from Proverbs 4, verses 1 and 2. In the introduction to the contemporary version of the Bible written by the language scholar Eugene Peterson, he writes that the most important question we ask when reading the Bible is not, what does it mean? Although that is certainly very important. But rather the most important question is, how can I live this? How can I live this message? How can I live these precepts? How can I follow what I'm reading in the Bible? Now, when it comes to teaching of the Bible, I prefer to attach a story to the lesson. I mean, it's one thing to have an intellectual understanding of the words and what they mean and what they meant back in Bible times. But sometimes a story will illustrate how a lesson is played out in real life, what it feels like, how it is applied. And sometimes a story makes the teaching more memorable, more accessible. So this morning, I decided to share a story from the life of Abraham Lincoln, which illustrates a teaching from the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I do this advisedly because, while Lincoln had certainly read the Bible and spoke of God and used biblical imagery in his speeches, he did not belong to any church, nor did he speak of himself as being a Christian. Perhaps, like Mark Twain, he simply had too many experiences with people who claimed to be Christian but who lived otherwise. Or he had too many differences with the way some church people expressed their Christianity, and he simply did not want to be associated with them. So, the year was 1855. The Cyrus McCormick Reaper Company that had manufactured the mechanical reaper took the John Manny Company to court for patent infringement. Now, the Manny legal team was headed up by a high-powered Philadelphia lawyer by the name of George Harding, who was considered by many to be the greatest U.S. patent attorney of the late 1800s. His legal team also included the brilliant Edwin M. Stanton, who had passed the bar exam and argued his first case in court before he turned 21. He ultimately would be appointed to the Supreme Court. Since this patent case would most likely be tried in the federal courthouse in Chicago, Harding decided it would be a good idea to have an Illinois lawyer on the team. Even if this backwoods Illinois lawyer didn't know anything about the law, it might play with the sympathies of the judge or the local jury. So, sight unseen, he retained an Illinois lawyer by the name of Lincoln. And just when all of the details seemed to be in place, the court case was moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And when Lincoln showed up at the court, these esteemed Eastern lawyers could hardly believe their eyes. Harding described him as being tall, raw-boned, an ungainly backwoodsman who was wearing coarse, ill-fitting clothing. Neither was Stanton impressed. He referred to him as a long-armed ape who obviously doesn't know a thing about the law. certainly can't do us any good. A newspaper reporter commented that his suit had evidently been made by an unskilled tailor. Right off the bat, Lincoln found himself completely ostracized. Even though he stayed in the same hotel with the other lawyers on the team, none of them bothered to speak with him. He had no role to play during the week-long trial except as a spectator. George Harding later admitted that neither he nor Stanton ever conferred with him, had him at our table, sat with him, or walked to and from the courthouse with him. Well, for Lincoln, the rejection was painful. It was a humiliating experience. When he got off the train back home in Springfield, Illinois, he was feeling depressed. He was feeling beaten. Confided to his law partner that he had been roughly handled in Cincinnati. Now, in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you or mistreat you." Just 5 years later, just 5, Lincoln was elected as President of the United States. And as the southern states seceded and the Civil War began, Lincoln knew he needed the very best people that the country had to offer for his cabinet, even if they happened to be political enemies. Not long ago, the historian Doris Goodwin wrote a book about President Lincoln's cabinet entitled Team of Rivals, which explored the fact that everyone on his cabinet thought that they were not only smarter than Lincoln, but would certainly do a better job as president. Many did not hesitate to publicly criticize the president or to write critical articles for the newspapers. The president chose the best people he could find for the job, despite their many serious differences. And somehow he managed to hold the group together and keep them working together for the sake of the Union. He started with Pennsylvania Senator Cameron serving as Secretary of War on his cabinet, which was quite frankly, political payback for Cameron's support during the election. But Cameron was so corrupt, he was forced to resign, was sent to Russia as an ambassador. What Lincoln needed was a man who was scrupulously honest and who possessed a brilliant mind for details. And not being a man who held a grudge, Lincoln called upon Edwin Stanton. Yes, the very man who had simply brushed him off in Cincinnati. Now, Stanton was from a different political party, and quite honestly, he hated Lincoln and was never shy about telling anyone just what he thought about him. But he was honest. He was brilliant. He was capable of managing this enormous war effort and being responsible for more than 2 million men. The story is told of a congressman who came to see the president about getting the War Department's aid in a project. He had the proposal all written up, and the president read it over and liked it and signed it, and then instructed the congressman that he would need to get Stanton to sign off on this as well. Stanton read it over and said he would not sign it. But the president has signed it. Well, the president's a big fool, he said. The congressman went back to President Lincoln, who wanted to know why Stanton hadn't signed it. Boy, he shuffled his feet a bit, and he finally said, "Well, sir, Stanton said you were a big fool." President Lincoln thought about that for a bit, and he said, "Well, you know, Stanton is pretty smart about these things. If he said I was a fool, perhaps I am. I better go see him. Better go talk with him about this." And so he went. And Stanton shared his thoughts and his reservations. And ultimately, Lincoln tore the proposal up, having seen its implications in a brand new light. Eventually, Lincoln and Stanton came to respect and rely upon one another. The evening of April the 14th, 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth in the Ford's Theater while viewing a play with his wife, Mary. He was carried across the street to the Peterson boarding house and laid diagonally across a small bed. Hearing the news, Stanton came to be with him, and as he died, he uttered those immortal words, "Now he belongs to the ages." Following Lincoln's death, Stanton even wrote a book about Lincoln, praising his intellect, his humility, and his work at leading the nation through this great crisis. He later admitted, "What a mistake I made about this man when I first met him in Cincinnati. And what a blessing it was for the country that Abraham Lincoln was the sort of man that could forgive and forget rather than being locked up with a desire for revenge and for retribution that would have hurt everybody." Fortunately, he had learned to turn the other cheek, particularly with the scathing criticism that he faced during the Civil War. Southern newspapers called him a tyrant and a demon. Even Union General McClellan made derogatory remarks, calling him a baboon. George Templeton Strong, a prominent New York lawyer, wrote that Lincoln was a barbarian, a Scythian, a Yahoo, and a guerrilla. Well, Jesus said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say for you, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone strikes you insultingly on the right cheek, turn the other also." Is it easy? Of course it isn't easy. In Lincoln's wallet, he carried 8 newspaper clippings that were all complimentary, positive about him. One in particular, an editorial from a London newspaper, had been folded and unfolded, read and reread so many times it was tearing apart at the creases. And it was what Lincoln needed to try to keep his emotional balance and equilibrium during the dark, dark days of that war, when facing storms of negative criticism. No, it's not easy to overlook unkind remarks and criticisms of people. But you know, this same forgiving attitude carried over to the enemies in the South. As the Union Army was chasing down the army of Northern Virginia, Lee was advised to scatter his army, let them hide in the hills where they'll be able to carry on a guerrilla conflict for years. And Lee refused, knowing that the bloodshed and the destruction and the killing would go on for decades. When General Grant dictated the terms of surrender to Lee, they were in keeping with the mercy that was such a part of Lincoln's nature. The soldiers of the South were simply paroled and sent home. officers could keep their sidearms. Enlisted men who had brought a horse or a mule with them into the army could take one home, so they would have something with which to do their spring plowing. Rations were sent across the line to feed Lee's hungry men. With Lincoln's assassination, the South lost one of its best friends, who, like a watchful father, was anxious to bring them back and restore them into the family. Well, it's obvious that few of us will ever be commanding generals of armies or presidents of countries. But we might find ourselves watching our grandchildren at a little league game when a ref makes a poor call. We might find ourselves disagreeing with a neighbor over a property line, or balking at the outrageous cost of a car repair. It's so easy, it's so human of us to react in a manner that is perhaps emotionally satisfying, rather than to consider what Jesus would have us do in that situation. May God help each of us to do better. Amen.